Hello everyone. I've created this tutorial for you for three reasons. The first of which is to understand Ishmael's narrative style. The second of which is to understand or know the structure of chapter 42, The Whiteness of the Whale, so that you can do well on your midterm test this Friday. And then it's also just to look at how I use the title and the introduction to anticipate what I'm about to read, or the text. So let's start with number one. Okay, Ishmael's narrative style. Now, I think that this book and his writing and thinking is sort of complicated, but it's a little less so if we can understand how he thinks and how he writes. What we're used to in essays and news articles and a lot of types of writing is when a writer starts with something that you know, something known or something that the writer knows and wants to convince you of, they express this in their thesis or main idea or argument. And for example, if I wanted to come up with an essay idea, I could think about how the Knicks are perhaps one of the most disappointing basketball teams in the history of the NBA. So that would be my thesis, or the known, the idea that I know and then want to prove. So I start with the introduction to the topic. I talk about the history of the NBA or basketball or sports or whatever it is, and then I introduce my thesis, which is that they're the most disappointing sports team. And then I get into the body, which is where I support my thesis with reasons or evidence. I could talk about their record, I could talk about how much money they have, I could talk about the fact that they are the arguably the center of the cosmopolitan world, being in New York City, and that they are still so terribly disappointing, and how that alone is so terribly disappointing. Anyway, and then I conclude by restating what I said and zooming out to show how my idea fits into the bigger picture. So that's sort of the general approach to essays. It starts with something known and then it supports this known idea so that you are also persuaded by this main idea as being true. Ishmael thinks and writes differently, and for the most part his writing, the structure of each chapter, to some extent the structure of his thoughts, follows a different path. He begins with a topic like the ocean, for example, and he notices something curious about that topic. Like, for example, we all seem to be drawn to the ocean. And then he asks why. He thinks about why this is so. And then he launches into an exploration of that topic in hopes of understanding it, in hopes of answering that question. So he begins with an unknown, which is why we're all drawn to the ocean. And then he tries to take this exploration to find the known, to answer his question, to come to a place of understanding through this exploration of details and examples. But the problem is that for the most part, that place that he hopes to get to, that place of understanding, doesn't really exist, or it doesn't come, he doesn't get there. And often what he finds is that what he was hoping to find is just actually more blurry and less defined than he thought. So that sort of, in a nutshell, is one of the ways that he thinks. And so that's Ishmael's narrative style for the most part. And now let's look at the title of this chapter, chapter 42, The Whiteness of the Whale. And then I will show you the structure of this chapter so that you can read it more easily. So, to begin, look at the title of whatever you're reading. In this case, it's The Whiteness of the Whale. So ask yourself, what can we know, what can we anticipate based on this title? Well, we can know that based on this title, which is The Whiteness of the Whale, that this chapter probably has something to do with the color of the whale. And then Knowing that, let's read the introduction. So we'll start here. What the white whale was to Ahab has been hinted. What at times he was to me as yet remains unsaid. So just pause there. What we can draw from this is that already in the book we have understood, he's explained why Ahab, or what Moby Dick means to Ahab, but he hasn't yet explained what it means to him. And so we can guess that that probably has something to do with the whiteness of the whale, and that this chapter will be an explanation of what the whale, Moby Dick, means to him, Ishmael. So let's read from there. Aside from those more obvious considerations touching Moby Dick, which could not but occasionally awaken in any man's soul some alarm, there was another thought, or rather vague, nameless horror concerning him, which at times, by its intensity, completely overpowered all the rest, and yet so mystical and well nigh effable was it that I almost despair of putting it in a comprehensible form. It was the whiteness of the whale that above all things appalled me. But how can I hope to explain myself here, and yet in some dim, random way explain myself I must, else all these chapters might be naught. So let's pause. This thing that he finds most striking about the whale horrifies him. And the thing that horrifies him the most is the whiteness of the whale. It's the thing that most appalls him. And then in this final sentence, what we see is he's telling us that he needs to try and explain why this whiteness horrifies him so much, because if he can't explain it, then the rest of these chapters, the rest of the book, will be meaningless. So that's the introduction. And the rest of the essay follows this same pattern. It's this unknown. The unknown in this case is that he knows that the whiteness appalls him and frightens him, but he doesn't know why. And then he takes this explorative he explores this problem or this issue in order to try to understand it, in order to understand whiteness and why it so frightens him. And through this exploration, he hopes to come to some place of understanding. Let's look at the structure of the essay, because my job is not to tell you what it said, what he comes to. Your job is to figure out why whiteness appalls him. But I will help you by showing you the structure of the essay. So here we go. This first part, identified by this green line, talks about the places that he can think of and the parts of life that he can think of where whiteness refiningly enhances beauty. Where whiteness, when something is white, it shows that whiteness typically can symbolize power, that it can symbolize purity, that it can make things more beautiful, like marbles and pearls. And in some cases, it can show in the Hanoverian flag, it shows a snow white tiger, which expresses a very powerful nation. So moving on, he talks about in all of these places along this green line, he talks about places where whiteness has been associated with either power, purity, or beauty, or something like that. And then he says, from here, yet for all these accumulated associations with whatever is sweet, honorable, and sublime, there yet lurks an elusive something in the innermost idea of this hue, or color, which strikes more of panic to the soul than the redness which affrights in blood. Now, the rest of this chapter is an exploration of where white is especially frightening, and he mentions a number of examples and explains why. He tries to figure out why it's so frightening. So here he talks about polar bears, here which are very white. Here he talks about white sharks. or the great white shark. Here he talks about the albatross. Here he talks about the white steed of the prairies. Here he talks about an albino man. Here nature, and when blizzards are can be so frightening. And even the visible quality and the aspect of the dead is appalling. The fact that corpses, their corpse's skin turns white. And then, of course, this beautiful line here, ghosts rising in a milk-white fog. This is a pretty frightening image. So he goes on to explore these things. He compares architectural structures, he compares mountains, and he talks about how the White Sea is more frightening than any other sea. And then he talks about Lima, the city of Lima, and how the buildings have this white hue and how there's something about it which disturbs him. So this passage here, he then pauses and he says, well, let me try and imagine whiteness as just the color. When it's not given, when it's not coming through an object, it's just the pure color. And then he goes on to come up with scenarios in which one could actually imagine that. This one is the most beautiful, I think. It is when he talks about how how whiteness, the feeling that one gets when one experiences a sublime kind of blank whiteness in this passage. So check that out, and then finally we get to a place where he tries to understand. He tries to get to a place of knowing, right? Here, a place of understanding about why whiteness frightens him. And your task, for the most part, will be to interpret this passage, but don't forget to read this stuff as well. It should be a little bit easier to read with this tutorial. And that's all. Best of luck, and see you in a day or two. All right, bye-bye.